At one point in human history, our species came so close to extinction that if a few dozen people had died differently, you would not exist today. Not your family, not your lineage, not even the possibility of you. Around 70,000 years ago, the number of breeding humans on this entire planet may have dropped to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals, possibly fewer. Geneticists did not discover this through fossils. They discovered it through you, written into your DNA as unusually low genetic diversity, far lower than you would expect in a species spread across every continent on Earth. Scientists call this a population bottleneck, often linked to the Toba supereruption, a volcanic event so large it blocked sunlight globally for years, collapsing food chains across entire continents. Most humans alive at that moment did not survive. They starved, froze, scattered into environments that stopped supporting life, and disappeared without a trace. The few who made it through were not stronger or more intelligent than the ones who died. They were operating something else entirely, a system, because individual ability had reached its limit. The environment was too unstable, the demands too extreme, the margin too narrow. Alone, no human being was enough. Without the system, you die. The Ice Age was not a stable emergency. It was a sequence of compounding disruptions, each arriving before the damage from the last had been repaired. Temperatures did not drop and hold, they swung violently, sometimes within a single human lifetime. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Grasslands fragmented. Rivers vanished. Sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters, exposing land bridges while drowning coastal ecosystems that had fed entire communities for generations. A hunter could spend a lifetime mastering one landscape and find within 20 years that it no longer existed. Strength could not compensate for food that had ceased to exist. Intelligence could not stabilize a world that was structurally unstable. The archaeological record is clear. Sites appear, show occupation, then are abandoned. Populations emerge and vanish without continuity, leaving tools but no descendants. What survived was not the group with the best hunters. It was the groups that built something stable inside instability, a system that worked not just in good conditions, but specifically in the worst ones. Because when the environment breaks, without the system, you die. That system began with group structure. Not large communities, but small, tightly coordinated units of 20 to 50 individuals, where each person's survival was a structural requirement for the whole. Every individual carried knowledge no one else could fully replicate. Someone tracked animal migration across hundreds of kilometers. Someone managed fire, not just lighting it, but preserving it as a resource too expensive to lose. Someone knew which plant compounds stopped bleeding or controlled fever. Someone read weather well enough that a wrong read could cost the group a hunt or a life. When any one of those people died, the loss was structural. A critical function disappeared. If that knowledge could not be transferred quickly, the gap would be exploited by conditions the group could no longer handle. Teaching was not a cultural practice. It was as essential as food. A group that passed knowledge faster than the environment could destroy it endured. A group that could not left no descendants. Isolation was not a setback. It was a terminal condition measured in days. Without the system, you die. At the core of the system was energy, specifically the form that energy needed to take. In sustained extreme cold, the human body burns calories at a rate most modern people have never experienced. Arctic studies document metabolic increases of 30 to 40% above baseline during winter, and here is what surprises most people. Lean meat alone cannot meet that demand. It does not just fall short. Under certain conditions, it kills you. The condition is called rabbit starvation, or protein toxicity. Without sufficient fat, the liver cannot process the nitrogen load from metabolizing large quantities of lean protein. The body feels full. The cellular machinery is failing. Weakness develops, thermoregulation degrades, and eventually organ failure follows. Early humans learned this by watching people die on diets adequate by volume, but catastrophically wrong in composition. The fattiest portions of every kill, bone marrow, brain, organ tissue, became the most protected resources in the group. Fat-powered thermogenesis, the internal heat generation that kept core temperature above the threshold where cognition and motor control begin to fail. Without it, every other survival behavior becomes impossible to execute. Without the system, you die. Generating heat is only half the equation. Retaining it is a separate engineering problem entirely. Ice Age clothing was not primitive protection. It was thermal management refined over thousands of years of failure and survival. Layered hides, with specific fur orientation and air gaps, created stable microclimates the body's own heat output could maintain. Archaeological evidence from sun gear in Russia, dated to 34,000 years ago, shows burial garments assembled from thousands of individually sewn ivory beads. Investment that only makes sense if clothing was a survival-critical technology. But the system was fragile in lethal ways. If inner layers became saturated with moisture, insulating air gaps collapsed. If wind penetrated the outer layer, convective loss could reach lethal levels within an hour. These were not inconveniences, they were kill switches. A seam that split, a hide improperly cured, a gap left exposed during sleep, any single failure could initiate a cascade. The body had no mechanism to reverse. The difference between surviving a night and not was not effort or willpower. It was whether the system held. Without the system, you die. Night was where the system was most vulnerable. When the body becomes still and metabolic activity drops, heat production falls sharply and the environment takes control. At -15 °C with moderate wind, an unprotected adult can lose consciousness from hypothermia in under an hour, not in extreme conditions, in moderate ones. Our ancestors managed this with a solution as physically precise as it was socially transformative. Communal sleeping, bodies arranged in close contact, minimizing exposed surface area, sharing metabolic heat to create a collective thermal zone no individual could sustain alone. A single body radiating heat into open air loses it almost immediately. Multiple bodies in contact create a shared boundary where each person's output reinforces the warmth of the others. Remove one body and the zone weakens. Remove several and the system fails at its edges. Who slept where? Who tended fire through the coldest hours? These were not random. They encoded the group's social structure into the architecture of survival every single night. When it failed silently, before sunrise. Without the system, you die. Shelter extended the system into the physical environment itself. Ice Age structures were not crude approximations of protection. They were engineered boundaries between two thermal regimes, lethal cold outside, survivable warmth within. The mammoth bone structures at Mazirek in Ukraine, dated to 15,000 years ago, used interlocking bones from dozens of animals arranged with geometric intention, covered with hides to create sealed interior spaces. The problem was precise. Too much airflow and heat escaped faster than it could be produced. Too little ventilation and carbon monoxide from interior fires accumulated to toxic levels. The range between those two failure modes was narrow, found not through intuition but through generational refinement each winter, a full-scale test. Each group that failed removing itself permanently from the knowledge pool. Shelter was not a structure. It was a machine for maintaining the thermal conditions human physiology requires to function. And like every machine in the system, it worked only when every component was correctly maintained. When the boundary failed, the environment did not pause for repairs. Without the system, you die. What separates this system from ordinary adaptation is the nature of the dependency between its parts. Each element is not merely supported by the others, each is required by them. Remove fat, and the body cannot generate heat regardless of the clothing. Thermogenesis requires fuel. Maintain the diet but remove clothing, and that heat dissipates within minutes. Insulation converts generation into retention. Keep both but remove shelter, and sustained exposure overwhelms the entire thermal budget. Maintain all three, but remove the group, and the system collapses differently. No shared body heat at night, no cooperative hunting, no one to tend fire while others sleep, no one to carry knowledge forward when its holder dies without warning. This is why extinction came so close. Partial solutions were not insufficient. They were fatal. A group that had solved 3 of the 4 components did not survive at a reduced rate. It did not survive. The threshold between extinction and continuity was total integration. Below it, there was no gradient. There was only time. Without the system, you die. Once the system reached full integration, what the human species could access changed entirely. Environments that had been barriers became corridors. Conditions that had been death sentences became manageable. Homo sapiens moved into territories that eliminated every other large primate, not because our biology changed, but because our system crossed from reactive survival into controlled expansion. The Yana site in Siberia, dated to 32,000 years ago, shows human occupation during one of the coldest periods of the last 100,000 years. The crossing into the Americas, now placed at 20 to 25,000 years ago, required sustained movement through environments as hostile as anything Ice Age Europe had produced. These were not accidents. They were the output of a fully operational system: diet, clothing, shelter, group structure, and transmitted knowledge all functioning together. Survival stopped being a state the group was perpetually fighting to maintain. It became a platform, a foundation from which to expand. Without the system, you die. With it, you move. The Ice Age did not simply threaten human survival. It built the architecture of everything that followed, the cooperative instinct that activates in you under genuine pressure, the way your body prioritizes fat storage above every other energy reserve, even now in conditions of abundance, where that same tendency causes health problems. The metabolic systems that increase heat production when core temperature drops, systems so conserved they function identically in a person today as they did 30,000 years ago on an Ice Age steppe. The physical discomfort of prolonged isolation that registers not as loneliness, but as something closer to pain. These are not cultural habits. They are the residue of a selection process so extreme that only the humans who embodied every element of the system completely made it through. The ones who hoarded rather than shared, the ones who could not hold cohesion under sustained pressure, the ones whose systems had gaps. They are not your ancestors. They did not survive long enough to pass anything on. You exist because a small number of human beings, in one of the most hostile periods this planet has produced, built something that held long enough to create the next generation, and the next, and the unbroken chain that eventually produced you. The Ice Age nearly erased us, and in nearly erasing us, it made us into exactly what we needed to become. The system that saved them is still inside you. The only difference is, you no longer depend on it. If you are drawn to the hidden systems that shaped human survival, subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows, because the oldest systems are still running. You just stopped noticing them.